And to do this, we're going to start by understanding what happens under isometric conditions. So understanding what happens really when there is no direct change in the length tension relationship of the muscle. And the reason to do this is isometric conditions provide one, a unique environment for us to actually evaluate fatigue, but two, it's a really nice starting place to get our understanding developed. So what actually happens? Well, if we look at this data set here in this graph, what we've got is we've got a contraction time here, so this is isolated muscle fiber. We've got contraction time here going across 60 seconds. And what you can see is that this is the force, so this is a muscle that is being held statically, so it's an isometric contraction. And what you can see is there is a stimulation of 20 hertz, and what you can see is the force output. So remember that the key thing here is that the muscle is neither lengthening or shortening, there's just this kind of holding, it's almost like tetanic contraction, is that the force output decreases, and it's decreased in the order of about 25% over 60 seconds. Now, why? Well, this is where you get into those performance mechanisms, those more peripherally orientated factors that Anoka was referring to. Well, the first thing to notice is that the ATP concentration does decrease, but it's not dramatic, right? It's not a significant decrease in the ATP concentration. So one can argue, well, it's not a lack of ATP availability. Well, that's reinforced to a certain degree by what we see here. Look at the change in the PCR concentration. So the phosphocreatine concentration shows an enormous decrease within the first 15 to 20 seconds. It's a very, very significant decrease. But then you'll notice that its kind of change is fairly similar across the remaining 40 to 45 seconds. But there is a concurrent increase in the blood lactate concentration. Now, don't be fooled into thinking, well, that's the lactate is kind of your evidence of some form of fatigue. Lactate is just really our proxy indicator of glycolysis. Remember, the only reason the lactate concentration increases is fundamentally if we get an increase in substrate level glycolysis. So if there's an increased energy production from glycolysis of the use of muscle glycogen without direct involvement of the tricarboxylic acid cycle and Krebs, you'll get an increase in the blood lactate concentration. So it's kind of an indication, a proxy indication of something that's going on here, is these are both indications of oxygen-independent metabolism, what is perhaps uniformly referred to as anaerobic substrate metabolism, despite the fact really that fundamentally at 20 hertz, yes, the muscle is being held isometrically, but it's at 20 hertz, it's a low level of force generation. So what is going on? Well, the limiting factor actually, oddly, seems to be oxygen availability. Well, that seems really odd because one, we've not referred to it here in this slide, but where's the connection here between oxygen availability and these changes, particularly in PCR and lactate as our proxy indicator of glycolysis? Well, this is where it perhaps starts to become apparent. If we get somebody to do a maximal voluntary contraction, which again is isometric, but what we do is we get them to hold it around 15 to 20% of the MVC. So they're holding the muscle statically, but they're only working at about 15 to 20% of the maximum force they can produce. What we see is there is no limitation through oxygen availability. So oxygen supply is not limited at around 15 to 20% of the MVC. However, as is reported in this reference from the late 80s, when we hit around 50% of the MVC, muscle blood flow is almost zero. Now there is your connection. Because as soon as you reduce muscle blood flow, the automatic response is that you create a hypoxic environment and we start to get dysoxia. And so the net result is you'll get an increased reliance on those non-oxidative sources of energy, so PCR, substrate level glycolysis, as we can see here. So this is a really good indication that we've got this kind of lack of oxygen coming into the cell, reflected by these significant changes in both PCR and glycolysis. But why would that be the case? Where is the connection? Well, the connection is quite simply, under isometric conditions, you're creating a pressure. That is, a pressure is being applied to both arterial inflow and venous outflow. So when we're working at about 15 to 20% of the MVC, we are getting very, very little pressure being created on arterial inflow. There'll be some pressure created on venous outflow. Why is this happening? Well, fundamentally, as soon as you go isometrically above 50% of the MVC, remember that muscle is working within an area. So it's got to compress something in order for the muscle to expand, to contract. And part of that compression is you push and compress down on the arteries and the arterioles and onto that capillary network, and therefore reduce oxygen inflow to the muscle. And particularly when we're working beyond 50% of the MVC, we're certainly getting the impact also then on venous outflow. So the net result is there's a lack of oxygen coming in, there is a lack of clearance in terms of byproduct from metabolism under isometric conditions. And we can see that in this schematic here. Oops. So if we look at this schematic here, what you can see is, okay, so let's reinforce this a little bit. So let's use this data set that we've got here, this graph, to kind of help us understand what is going on. So this is a sustained isometric contraction. And what you can see here is we've got our metabolite concentrations, and we've got predominantly two concentrations I want you to focus on. Don't worry about H2PO4. I want you to focus on the concentration of phosphate and the concentration of PCR. And what we can see is that under this isometric condition, we see that the concentration of phosphocreatine, as we saw in the previous slide, decreases. You get a rapid decrease and then remains pretty much stable over the course of this time period. At the same time, you get an increase in the phosphate concentration, and this is often referred to as the free phosphate concentration. So why is this important? Why is this happening? Remember, you're reducing oxygen availability. Because you're reducing oxygen availability under isometric conditions, beyond probably 50% of the MVC, we rely on these non-oxidative sources, such as PCR. So what happens is that fundamentally you cleave the phosphate from the PCR, you donate that to ADP, and then the ADP in essence is added to the phosphate, you get ATP. The ATP is interacted on by water, and we get the process of energy release. But once we get the process of energy release, remember what you're subsequently left with now is the ADP and the phosphate. And remember that this is a rapid process. So the net result is that we start to get an increased concentration of free phosphates that haven't had the ability to be recombined with the ADP. And this is kind of a classic consequence that we see, not just under isometric conditions, but under all kind of even dynamic conditions, but it's kind of exemplified here under these isometric conditions. Now let's reinforce that a little bit with what we see, again, taken from this work from Kent Braun, what happens over this same time period. So here we've got, not surprisingly, over the same time period, which is 240 seconds, we get a decrease in force output. And that again conforms to the definition of ANOCA, and it also conforms to the definition that we saw from Edwards and Thomas right at the start of this session, which is there has to be, unless there is a decrement in task outcome, task performance, then we haven't really got fatigue. So we can see this evidence of fatigue, and it's quite large, isn't it? We've gone from 100%, that's where we start. So there's about an 80%, just under, an 80% decrease in force output over this 240-second time period. But look what we also see as well, over this same time period, we start to get a decrease in what's called the IEMG. So this is the integrated EMG signal. And it's simply a representation of neuromuscular capability. So if we're trying to generate force, we have to increase the amount of neuromuscular recruitment. More muscle fibers need to be recruited. But what we're seeing is force output, if you look at kind of the slopes, they're pretty similar. Force output declines, and you get this kind of concomitant change or decrease in IMG activity, indicating for us that we're not only getting kind of metabolites changing, the change in the PCR and the free phosphate concentration, which one could absolutely argue are connected to decreases in force output. If PCR concentration is falling, then the ability to work anaerobically is going to decrease. But you can see there is a knock-on effect here in terms of neuromuscular function. So why is that the case? Is it that the central nervous system itself has become fatigued? Well, that would almost imply central fatigue. So what is going on here, beyond the neuromuscular junction, that is perhaps contributing to this decrease here, which is then in combination with our decreases in PCR concentration, but increases in free phosphate concentration, leading to this decrease here in force output? Well, actually, the contributing factor is almost certainly to do with pH. And what you can see, if you look at the pH concentration, if I flick it back, look at the pH response, look at the IMG, you can kind of see they're similar profiles. There's certainly a very similar profile between the change in force output and the change in pH. So we're getting a more acidic environment. And what we know is that acidity, which can be caused by various things, don't just automatically go to lactate. Lactate, remember, is just a byproduct of substrate level glycolysis. It's almost certainly a reflection of an increased hydrogen ion concentration, which is associated with lactate, absolutely. But it will also be associated with increases in things like ammonia concentration, for example. So the pH starts to decrease. What we know is cellular function starts to decline when the cell becomes more acidic. But we also know that as cell acidity increases and pH decreases, it has a direct effect on neuromuscular function. We get a slowing in the neural activity. Those neural pathways start to slow down. So the net result is we're getting a direct impact on both the availability of substrates. So we know enzymatic reactions slow down as pH starts to decrease, but we're also getting a direct action on the nervous system beyond the neuromuscular junction at this point. So these are all happening because under isometric conditions, you've got that lack of oxygen availability. You release the clamp in the terms of the isometric contraction, oxygen becomes available. You'll actually start to get quite quick restoration of both force, pH, and PCR concentrations. And you can kind of see this here, where we're taking it a stage further. So this is what happens when we occlude blood flow. So remember that one of the things we were arguing was under isometric conditions, you're reducing availability of both arterial inflow and venous outflow. So in this example here, it's not clear from the authors whether what they got was direct arterial occlusion. It's unlikely because they've worked on the human quadriceps. So you would need an excessively high pressure using an occlusion cuff to create that. But the net result is you're certainly getting a decrease in oxygen inflow and certainly getting an occlusion of venous return. But look at the effect here. When they do a sustained task, So sustained isometric task, what happens is there is a kind of direct effect when you compare males to females on the time to fatigue. So males and females, fairly similar responses. But now look at the effect when we occlude. Okay, when we occlude, what we see is that the time to failure, okay, you compare occluded to non-occluded, okay, you can see the time to failure is better, particularly for females in the non-occluded states, because they've got greater oxygen availability. And you can see the same in this condition here, where we've got a sustained task and you've got an intermittent task. So when the task is sustained, the time to failure is far shorter than when it's intermittent. Because as soon as you go to an intermittent based activity, as soon as you release the isometric contraction, you get an increased oxygen availability into the muscle, and also get an increase in venous return from the muscle. So the net result is you have greater oxygen availability and greater restoration, therefore, of things like the PCR concentration and the free phosphate concentration starts to decrease, lactate levels start to fall, pH starts to rise, all because of that oxygen availability. And if we go one stage further, this is a paper that came from one of my PhD students. And here what you've got is we've got a number of participants, and what we've got here is we've got what's called their tissue saturation index. This is really an indication of the availability of oxygen. And what happens is we've got them across these time points here, and at this time point here, what we do is we occlude blood flow. And what we've done here is we've done this on the arm, so we've actually occluded arterial inflow. Now look at the direct effect on tissue saturation index, how saturated the tissue is with oxygen. Look at the direct effect. Suddenly oxygen availability decreases. Not instantly, okay, because once you apply that clamp, there is still oxygen below the clamp, below the pressure cuff. And that oxygen is then being utilized in the cell. But at some point, that oxygen availability disappears. So if you now connect the dots and you go, well, okay, oxygen availability has declined. What's the net effect? Well, under these conditions, we've now created a hypoxia. And because we've created a hypoxia, the cell is having to now rely on those non-oxidative sources for energy provision. It's having to rely on PCR. It's having to rely on glycolysis. It's having to rely on a changing pH environment, so the cell's becoming more acidic. But you can see the immediate effect. Actually, when we release the clamp, which we do here, you get this direct effect here, and actually you get a very, very rapid restoration. In fact, actually, it's quite beneficial that you can see, actually, you get what's called a hyperemia, where you get this overreactive response, and then it comes back to baseline, actually within a matter of minutes. So that's just a kind of an applied way of exploring what happens when we reduce oxygen availability to the cell, as we see under isometric